Madness vs. Machines, otherwise known as simply Madness or MM1, was the third Community MvM operation launched by Potato's MvM servers. It was announced on January 11th of 2019, 2 months after the launch of Canteen Crasher, and set to launch on May 17th. However, the launch date was pushed back to October 2nd as a soft launch, until Madness would later fully launch on November 22nd. It ran towards the next year, up until March 31st of 2020, where Match Mediocrity would take its place until April 16. Madness would return after the date, and would then officially conclude on July 9th of 2020. Now, much like Titanium Tank and Canteen Crasher, Madness was a historically significant operation that did many things. It was also the biggest operation in history, in more ways than one. Jumping off of Canteen Crasher's hybrid MvM contest structure, Madness opted for a co-op contest charity campaign, with a much more emphasis on co-op, more on that later. Because we're still in the old era of Community MvM, there was a whole lot of formal documentation with the event. We'll start with how they organized the contest, which, by the way, this poster just looks hilarious to anybody that's ever played Machine Attacks. Anyway, Madness hosted a submissions contest that ran at the same time it was announced, up until May 15, which was a few days before the supposed launch, but as mentioned before, the launch was delayed, so the contest did eventually end on the 7th of November. The contest was handled along the same lines of Canteen Crasher, but with a few caveats. Aside from the absence of item submissions, which used to be a thing that nobody ever used, map makers could submit a map with only one intermediate or one advanced mission rather than both at once. Mission makers could submit intermediates and advanced missions like usual, but they were also able to submit expert missions, which would make Madness the very first operation to introduce them. However, you needed to have a mission of a lower difficulty passed in order to do so. It was all for good reason, however. It's a label that is a lot more ambiguous and leads to many different interpretations of what a challenging MvM experience should be. For Madness, they set a long list of guidelines, but what it basically boils down to is having an expert mission that is both fun and challenging. 2 Valve missions were cited as well-received approaches to expert. Broken Parts, even though it's an advanced mission, was cited for its extremely high payout but a large amount of robot spam. Manslaughter, which is an actual expert mission, was also cited for its low money but clever approach to bot compositions. One thing the organizers were heavily against though was being extremely stingy with cash, because what happens is metas being forced onto the players and the experience being overall less enjoyable. These can include things such as heavy stacking, forcing certain loadouts like Flog and Beggars, and plenty of min-maxing and cheesing. There were some other reasons, but all these things are what Potato thought was a step too far with the expert label. But of course the missions and later entries would break this guideline, and at the end of it all, they just simply wanted the expert missions to be sane and enjoyable to play. Besides all that, both map and mission creators were able to touch up on old work and submit them rather than starting from scratch. However, the biggest and most notable change from Canteen Crasher was the removal of contest rules. Instead, there was just none at all, besides asking those to use basic ethics and common sense with the intention to give creators full freedom. The judging guidelines would also see a massive cut, and by that I mean the criteria in the document was just literally one line. Is the map or mission generally enjoyable to play? Now initially, Potato still ran the old pass-fail system, where you just needed one pass by a team of judges, and if a submission happens to fail, then the contestant would just resubmit with changes over and over again until it would eventually get passed. However, sometime around August, they implemented a 3-strike system to limit the amount of resubmissions. This was done after the delay of Madness's launch, so in other words, the judges were basically in crunch mode. It was only implemented for those that were made individually, so any missions that were made alongside their respective maps were safe for the most part. There also wasn't any sort of no-strike score like what Potato has nowadays, so the missions realistically only had 3 chances to get in. For the maps, they wanted them to be in a mostly done state before the end of August. Now, I'm not entirely sure all this was the reason why Madness saw the highest amount of submissions. At this point in time, there was a considerably high engagement with Community MvM, especially after the launch of Canteen Crasher, and not to mention with TF2 itself in general. I also wouldn't blame it all on the lack of contest rules or judging guidelines. Potato has pretty much figured things out by this point, so there was enough for a reason to rely more on intuition. What I will say is that Potato has always had a problem with deadlines. They kept extending the contest further and further with Canteen Crasher, and they did it again with Madness. It's for the usual reasons, of course, but an even bigger reason this time was the release of Memes vs. Machines. It had its own contests and rules, and 2 rounds of it as well. And unlike Canteen Crasher and Madness, they really made sure to release it on time, that being April Fools. It offered a unique experience for its time that would later become its own spin-off series, which I've already covered every single entry in its entirety, which you can check out after the video. But to get back on topic, Memes vs. Machines was an operation that probably should not have happened in the same year as Madness. Amidst the server problems as well as the judging queue that had likely gotten massively backlogged by this point, it was one more burden added that pushed the launch date back. Initially, the launch was set for June 1st, but 2 months after the launch of Memes, it was announced that the campaign will release whenever we have the campaign done. With the launch date pushed back, so was the contest deadline, which as we know today would be November 7th. At the end, they had an extremely bloated submission list of 153, and somehow through it all, after almost 1 year, they had successfully brought in a grand total of 98 missions, 27 intermediates, 57 advanced, and 14 experts, spanning across 45 maps on launch. And goddamn, that's a pretty high number. Organizing memes while developing Madness was definitely the biggest mistake Potato had ever made, but at the same time, it did give us a wonderful series, and 2019 was one last chance they could have unique medal bottles, so perhaps it was the good kind of mistake. Being advertised as a contest charity campaign, Madness was the very first operation to directly support a charity fundraiser. At the time, it was for Extra Life, that was benefiting Children's Miracle Network hospitals. You were allowed to donate via cash, but also through item donations with scrap.tf. So long as any donated items matched the values per tier, you could also earn the medals this way, and it has been like this for the past 6 years by this point. However, there were 4 unique aspects to the way it was handled. The first was its most distinct quality, being that the charity ran alongside both the development and launch of Madness as well as continuing on to the next year. That, however, came with some complications, which plays in part the second aspect. Item donations were set to close on December 31st of 2019, and Potato didn't realize until later that the same would happen to cash donations. So the charity drive was closed on January 3rd of 2020, but then they managed to reopen the charity drive later on February 20th for cash donations. The third aspect was the medals, which I will discuss later into the video, but they had 2 donator medals. Madness set the groundwork for how charity medals would be earned through tiers, such as the Hopeful Heart, where you needed to donate at least $10. The second medal, Boundless Heart, was a rather weird one. You needed to donate at least $1 to earn it. However, you could only earn the Boundless Heart each time a $5,000 threshold was passed on the donation bar. This is where the co-op part from Madness's tagline comes in, which will be elaborated on further in a bit, but it also applied to donations. It wasn't too bad of an idea at the time, especially given the theme of the operation, although it would suck waiting to reach the next threshold if one gets passed, especially towards the tail end of the operation. The fourth aspect, which is unfortunately the most dark and tragic one, has to do with a certain individual. On December 8th of 2019, a user by the name of Shield had donated $2,500 to the charity, which was a staggering amount of money that had placed him at the top of the Charity Donors Wall of Fame. 2 days after, it was confirmed that Shield had sadly passed away by taking his own life. From what very little information I can gather, Shield was one of, if not the very first person to figure out a couple of important MVM mission making tricks, those being passive weapons, spellbooks, and fixing sticky demo animations. Upon hearing the news of their unfortunate passing, Potato had asked their community to donate towards a GoFundMe page supporting Shield's family. In total, $6,000 was raised. His profile picture was also used as a server emote to honor his passing around this time. It may have been 6 years by this point as life goes on, but nevertheless, I am sorry to those that were deeply affected by this unfortunate event. Rest in peace, Shield. On a more lighter note, charity support was without a doubt the most significant addition to Community MvM's identity. Even in their first rodeo, they raised a lot of money for the charity, which is about $60,000, and every subsequent operation that followed afterwards still manages to rake in tens of thousands of dollars in support of those in need. Even to some of us that may not have had the incentive to donate, I'm fairly sure that Community MvM wouldn't be as significant as it is today if they weren't supporting charities. Now then, Madness's contest charity campaign was tagged with co-op and had a much more emphasis on that term. For the campaign, they've adapted most, if not all, of Canteen Crash's contracts to be a community-driven effort and contributed towards a contract progress bar. It was also not necessary to track them individually, as everything was done in the background. You also had all-class contracts with higher but generalistic goals and contributed 2 points instead of 1. Probably the most significant contract to take note of was the This is Madness contract, where you simply have to complete at least one wave in the entire campaign. This was obviously done to track unique players in the event, of which were a total of 45,601 players around this time. The downside with streamlining the contracts this way was that some of the more challenging ones were taken away. However, it was a good thing anyway because what they did instead was establish accolades, where they would grant a bonus multiplier to contract points that stacks additively when completing multiple of them during a mission. The biggest bangs for your bucks were the expert missions, of course, but there was also the mission of the day, where each day on the website's homepage were 3 missions, and upon completing one of the 3 would earn you the accolade for that day. The contract system played a large part in how the medals were earned. In total, there were 5 out of 8 medals to collect. There were 2 more that could be earned through charity donations, which we just covered, and only 1 was available to content creators, which was the pinnacle of ingenuity. The 5 medals that could be collected were also obtainable to content creators, but as far as players are concerned, you still had to play the tour yourself to earn them. Any missions you played in the campaign would contribute to the tour progress bar. Intermediate missions were worth 1 point points, advanced missions 3 points, and expert missions 5 points. Fun fact, the tour points used to be a lot higher. It used to be 4 points for intermediates, 6 points for advanced, and 8 points for experts. Then it got nerfed down a bit slightly, and then it got a second nerf that brought them down to the values that we know today. The tour points necessary to earn the medals were proportionate to the contract points needed. The medals also couldn't be earned until the contract points reached the same tier. 1 tour point, which basically equates to playing any single mission as well as being in the contest, earned you the Burnished Barrel. 25 tour points or having 1 advanced or intermediate mission accepted earned you the Grandiose Garnet. 50 tour points or having 1 advanced and 1 intermediate accepted earns you the Tempered Tourmaline. 75 tour points or having 1 advanced and 2 intermediate missions accepted earned you the Royal Rhodonite. And then in the final tier, by having 100 tour points or having 2 of both advanced and intermediate missions accepted earned you the Chaotic Crystal. Okay, so here comes the part where I talk about Madness's missions. As you can probably guess, I have a lot of things to say here, and not with just how many there are. In comparison to Canteen Crasher, the pacing was much more improved. There is far less waiting in between individual subwaves, and the robots do spawn at a more moderate pace. Of course, you might get a few missions where the dogshit pacing was still there and you constantly wait for robots to drop down and it pisses me off. However, for the most part, it actually was better than what came before, and you do spend more time shooting at things, which is always nice with this type of game mode. Madness had a bigger ratio of vanilla missions as opposed to the more custom ones. This means that the experience is a lot more closer to the more modern entries. Many missions may feature a small selection of custom bots, but for the most part contains vanilla content to maintain the familiarity one might expect from the standard Valve tours. Now obviously, you still had missions on the opposite end that wanted to push the limits of whatever tools they had at the time. We are still in the wild era after all, so pretty much anything went. Although I can say there was considerably far less amount of bullshit hidden stat boosts this time around. Now much like Canteen Crasher, there were still some recurring boss to be seen throughout the tour. What Madness had, at least from the top of my head, was Scorch Shot Pyros, and plenty of missions feature them in large swarms or as their subwaves. Now I'm sure everybody such as I hates being ignited from these pricks, and especially when you get sunlight from them and you can't do anything about it, but at the very least you can justify the fact that they're from the base MVM experience. Scorch Shot Pyros are the most common boss to come across. See what I did there? You do also see burning heater heavies and burning mailer soldiers that creep up from the prior operation, but they are thankfully very rare to come by in Madness, and they very likely became extinct after the fact. But there was one other type of bot, or I guess category for that matter, that does show up every now and again, and that was custom mission supports. Canteen Crasher had 2 very notable missions, Ultra Uplink and Whirly Wallop, and they were incredibly based for not only standing out in the tour, but for also having several custom bots that were noteworthy for their time. As a result, you had plenty of creators borrowing many elements from these missions, and mission supports was one of them. These can range from custom snipers, those that could explosive headshot, to other kinds of classes that take on the role of a sniper. There are also custom engineers, and while a few missions do customize them a fair bit, the most notorious ones to come across are engineers that silently teleport behind, build a sentry, and then die off screen. These are the worst types of engineers to come across because their icon only appears for half a second, and once again the announcer doesn't say anything whenever they show up. But besides that and other custom spies that aren't really too worth mentioning, there are indeed custom sentry busters, which are the most common out of the 4. There were several variations of sentry busters with one gimmick attached to them throughout the course of Madness. Some of them were fairly harmless, like one that just rains low damage bombs behind their trail, but then there were also others that were kind of bullshit, like those that run by with the battalion's backup that just randomly cucks your crit damage, or those that just throw milk and Girardi that slows you down. These 2 are by far the worst ones, but there are also a bunch of other gimmicky busters that are just made to be annoying, because mission makers think they're funny or something. Yeah, you don't really see these sentry busters anymore, and it is honestly for good reason. Then another thing that has more to do with experiencing the operation at the time was the implementation of global balance changes. These include changes to the air blast, reverting it back to its state before Jungle Inferno so that pyros don't just freely air blast giants around. The Scorch Shot's projectiles were replaced with the detonators, which was once again to prevent pyros from air blasting giants around, although to be honest I can't be bothered to find footage of it actually shooting detonator flares. Then there were a bunch of other upgrades that were disabled for being useless or just didn't work properly at one point. However, they did once ban the Explode on Ignite upgrade, and I say once because several years later the upgrade was re-implemented with several balance changes. It was quite a huge deal back then. Most MVM players care a lot more about progression in a PvE environment, and taking away an item that is extremely helpful in that regard does sour the mood a little. As controversial as the change was, it still remained a good decision because that meant the experience in Madness would be more consistent across several lobbies. The explosive gas upgrade really is just overpowered, and to many mission makers, they care a lot more about the overall experience being balanced both on design and gameplay. But now to address the elephants in the room, the title of this video. I have explained everything about this operation. Madness vs. Machines was well and truly Potato's magnum opus, purpose, setting ambitious goals surpassing what came before, and community engagement was at an all-time high. And much like Titanium Tank and Canteen Crasher, it established many important aspects that defines Community MvM today. And so now we come to the part where I tell you that this is easily among the worst operations to play, and that you should not complete the entirety of Madness vs. Machines today. I suppose I should start with how I went through all 98 of Madness's missions. I did play a little bit of it back in like August 2024, somehow I had the foresight of making this video a year and a half later. Then I decided to play much more of it in between the months of May and September, until I fully committed to finishing the operation between the months of October and December. Now, there were many reasons why it took so long to make this video. This channel does bounce back and forth between old and new MvM operations that come out. Ultra Barbecue came out in the same year I was gathering footage, so that was important to cover. But then I also had to talk about the 5 meme operations in great detail because we were finally getting a 6th one this year. But it all goes beyond content scheduling. All of my recording on Madness was done through Potato's archive servers, and that has a very small player base, no offense to archive players. As you can imagine, it does take forever to seed for said servers, and ask around on Discord for those that were willing to join and play. I honestly would not mind these delays and issues if it was like any other operation, but this is 98 missions we're talking here, and you can easily imagine how difficult it is to get through Madness. And you want to know how long it all took for me to complete? 44 hours. Maybe add like an extra hour or so just for waiting for players to join and play, because trust me, those minutes really do add up eventually. And yeah, that's like 9 to 10 more hours compared to the time I completed Canteen Crasher. Now, very fortunately, I happened to be playing Madness at the time, and during that event, I managed to earn the 5 medals just from completing the necessary amount of missions. In other words, I didn't 100% it. And looking back, I really must be one happy boy for only going after those medals. And considering that everybody managed to max out the contract points by the 8th of January of 2020, which was basically a month and a half from Madness's launch, there really was just zero reason to go and complete every single mission unless you had all the time in the world. And here I am 5 to 6 years later going back, and my god, do I regret it. Of course, that's not my only problem with Madness, because to no one's surprise, these old missions have not really aged that well. While I may have discussed the finer details earlier, I've neglected to mention how it feels to play Madness up to this point. And allow me to say that the vast majority of the experience Madness missions provide can be summarized with one single phrase: nothing ever happens. When I say that nothing ever happens, I mean that a majority of these missions are nothing to write home about. They are just so enthusiastically boring to play through. The most common trait across several Madness missions is that they all love to spawn several comets at a time, while having very few giants to deal with across several waves. You can make the argument that they balance these missions to better suit a lower skill group, making it much easier to work towards the contracts, which in retrospect it would make total sense. I don't know how much of the so-called balance testing was done, but man, a lot of these missions offer such a tremendously watered down experience. And imagine going through the exact same wave structures for several hours in the double digits, shooting comets for several minutes that die instantly and not putting much of a fight, while having giants pushing out with little to no assistance, barely making themselves to be an actual threat. Oh gee, I wonder why somebody would go through several burnouts completing the most middling tour imaginable. Now, that's not to say that Madness is entirely an operation to fall asleep to. There are indeed some unique missions to be found throughout the experience, but unfortunately, you are more than likely to stumble upon the more infamous ones. Yeah, I mentioned earlier that the missions can indeed get wild at times, and remember that just like with Canteen Crasher, you only needed one pass to get into the campaign, but damn, the bar really was risen high up with this entry. It really seems like a few of them completely ignored the idea of fun and enjoyable, and instead it conjured up some of the most inane design choices that make the missions anti-fun at times. And somehow they managed to make some of the unique advanced missions unironically harder than the experts. Speaking of experts, they are in fact pretty boring to complete. You'll have a few exceptions that come up with some of the worst boss and waves imaginable, but for the most part they are indeed easier to complete than the experts we know of today. In retrospect, it was a good thing. After all, they wanted to try and see if it works as the document would entail. I mean, hell, they even went out of their way to gatekeep experts by requiring you to complete 5 missions of lower difficulty. Madness is the only operation that ever done this. But yes, for the most part, the experts here do suffer from the same qualities as their lesser peers. And despite basically playing as an advanced but with fewer credits to work with, these missions do possess some discernible qualities that separates them apart from those in the other operations. For example, the Madness Madness experts can sometimes spam heavies everywhere, and all of these heavies are high skill. They can make it pretty much impossible to peek out, so mobility classes will just get shredded, especially with the more open maps. Another quality is having many giant medics that can pop quick fixes, also known as giant poppers. And specific to Madness, it's impossible to discern them based on the wave bar alone, because they all share the same icon as a regen or other medic variants. What also makes things worse is how the experts tend to rely on giant poppers a lot, and it gets very tedious and annoying when you have to sit there waiting for each one. Then the last thing is that the Madness experts tend to resort to giant grind fests, where they spawn a very large portion of giants for a wave, especially towards the finale. There's not really much strategy involved or much variation in how the bots are utilized, so oftentimes it feels like you're just mindlessly grinding through these segments. Honestly though, the expert lineup is really the only worthwhile experiences to complete in Madness, because you do actually get to see how Potato tried making expert missions on their first attempt, but if only that could have been said for the vast majority of the intermediate and advanced missions here. Now besides the experts, Madness also introduced a brand new mission type called Medieval MvM, and these medieval missions, like holy shit dude, like I seriously have to think that they made these missions just for you to easily complete the Demo Knight and Huntsman contracts. I've already expressed my thoughts on medieval missions as a whole in a separate video that you can watch, but holy Christ, these missions in Madness genuinely suck. The majority of bots in these missions are melee fodder, and it becomes so extremely tedious and mind-numbing getting through each and every single wave, on top of being restricted to medieval weapons. Some of the bots here do actually use ranged weapons, which I will commend Potato for at least trying to make medieval MvM work with primitive tools, but just because something is novel doesn't mean it should be made. And compounding with the qualities of Madness missions as well as being restricted on top of it, these missions are among the worst experiences in this operation. Now, allow me to say that the word complete that I've been repeating throughout is what you should be paying attention to. If we're comparing Madness missions to Canteen Crashers, they really are an improvement, fixing many of the pacing issues and maintaining as much of a vanilla experience as they were able to. I can forgive Madness for being easy and boring to play, for not really doing a whole lot with what was there, but has understandably been the start for some people that still remain within this community. When I played through Madness, I sat through every single mission back to back with breaks in between sessions. Fully knowing it was an old operation, I was willing to overlook its imperfections and recognize that some parts of it were genuinely good. But the one single aspect I can't overlook with Madness is its time to completion. It overstates its welcome. It should not have had as many missions as it did when they basically do the same thing over and over. I don't blame the judges for crunching their time away for an event that was already taking too long as it was, but genuinely, like a large percentage of Madness has so much filler to sit through, and getting through those sections for several hours really just drains your mental capacity after a while. A lot of these missions, dare I say, is slop. And it's taking this long for me to say it because that term wasn't even invented back then. But hey, that's just my opinion on Madness. And opinion aside, Madness still remains a very important chapter in Potato's history. But more importantly, it was made for a community of its time. It had an experience that is forever long gone. And all that's left are 98 missions that nobody talks about anymore. Until this fateful day, I didn't spend 44 hours over several months completing Madness for nothing. And so I'm gonna talk about each and every single one of its missions. Except not in this video. As you can tell by its title and length, I have split my coverage on Madness into 3 parts, including this one which just went over the context of Madness. Over the upcoming days, I will be releasing the other parts, where I'll be talking about all of its 27 intermediates, 57 advanced, and 14 expert missions. So if you're excited to continue watching my coverage on Madness, like and subscribe, and I will see you on part 2, where I'll be covering the first half of Madness's missions.